So we have a conversation, a little bit of presentation about our trip to Holy Land. That was Jason and Angie and Kim and I back in January. We went with Trinity Lutheran Seminary, about 30 some other folks that went with us, and spent about 2.5 weeks going through much of Israel, Palestine. Those are two separate things because of even politically how they're structured today, which is interesting, Palestinian territories, which are administered by Israel and such as that. So tonight we're going to look at some things that are particularly old. Each of the next 5, or this and the next 4, will have different topics each week. Some material is more recent, so if you've seen some of the things in the newsletter and such, we have some things that are very old. We have material about modern day. We have issues of just the conflict in the land over the years and centuries. So different topics each week. And I do know, for example, there is also some folks have asked me about this, and this is just an interesting point. This headpiece scarf, it is a traditional in the whole area. Now this particular one, and Jason got one that is a little bit different. They have men's scarves, they have women's scarves. The men's are sometimes known as a keffiyeh or a sheneh. I'm not sure exactly if those are pronounced right, but it's as close as I can get. And they do have different styles, but even how you wrap it is an interesting thing, because much like a lot of other things, somebody said, kind of like cowboy hats and things, what do you wear? And there was a reason. So I'm wearing this tonight. It was a neat thing that I got. But this is close to the style of where we got it in Bethlehem, a little store, a little shop off Major Square. And this is close to the style that was shown to us by the gentleman who ran that shop. And what he did mention is, if you wear sort of like this, it kind of looks like the way some folks would wear it, like in certain areas of Palestine. But if you were other parts of the Arabian area, they might wear it somewhat differently, and they know what it looks like. I couldn't tell you what the differences are. I just know that they're different. But I am wearing it this way tonight. Somebody else said that's not what it looked like when we were over there, because we didn't wear it like this the first time. Yes, but then if you live in an area where you have sandstorms, and if you're in Jerusalem in January and it is 40 degrees and 30-mile-an-hour winds, you realize you can wear this a lot of other ways too, and it becomes very, very convenient. So a very useful type of item. But just answering the question, why was I having this tonight? And why was I wearing it this way? So that's not really directly to this, but a little bit of an atmosphere. We'll share some things like that. What we do want to share with you tonight, what I want to start with, and I'm going to start with a topic on what's called Megiddo. And we're talking about one of these really old places. So Megiddo, if you can see this image, what you have is, this is looking from the Mediterranean. It's looking sort of from the northwestish towards the southeastish, if that makes sense. So you see the water, and if you notice that there's lots of mountains and then a flat land in between. This is a good general idea of what some of this area of Israel looks like. This is sort of northern Israel. On your tables, you have a couple handouts. You can share those. We can make more if you like. At the end of the night, if you don't want to take it home, just kind of pile them up and we'll bring them back out again next week. But you do have on one side of that, you have a map. And there's a couple maps. There's a modern day map and sort of an older time map, time of Jesus. There's also a little thing that gives you an image of Israel overlapped on top of North Carolina, and you can realize just how small Israel actually is. But this is an image that gives you a sense of the land texture. So you have this mountain range on one side. The red circle is around the city of Megiddo, or the tell, Megiddo. And a tell is a mound. It's another name for mound. And currently Megiddo is in this Jezreel Valley, which is the bread basket. So for all of you folks that came out of farming backgrounds, massive amounts of farming in this area. And this is also along what is known the Great Trade Road. Now if you see those mountains, if you were taking goods to transport down to Egypt, down to Saudi Arabia, down around that curve, then you would have to go through this area somehow, and you wouldn't want to go over the mountains. You'd want to go along that Jezreel Valley. So what Megiddo is, and is this very visible area that controls the access and the path of what was known as the Via Maris, the Great Trade Road, because you just didn't have any other good way to get through anywhere. And that's one reason that Israel is in the middle of all of these things where you have conflict and people would fight over it, because whoever controlled Megiddo controlled the trade routes. Who controls the trade routes? You control the money. You can tax people, you can stop it, you can get them to go places. So this was right in the middle of where everything kind of funneled. If you were coming out of Europe, out of areas like Turkey or Greece and around or something like that, you came through this area. A little bit of an image, I'll just let you watch that. This is a panoramic view from the top of Megiddo. So it's a quick image, but you can see that this is up in the air a good ways. It has great visibility over that valley. You can see all the green, the farming areas over there. You can also see, as we mentioned, this particular area. Now this is in January, so it's sort of the rainy season. It's the moist season. It hasn't dried out yet. But it's also where they have a lot of their farming, these kinds of plants and such. So this is a good green, fertile area. And this is a mound that has a great deal of visibility. But you know what? It wasn't always a mound like that. Some things happen over time. To give a little bit of a clue, Megiddo has been a settlement of some kind. The earliest remnants of it are 6,000 BC. That's 6,000 years before Jesus. That's about 5,000 years before David and Solomon. So that gives you an idea of just how long this goes. There are 26 layers of ruins. So if you go in archaeology, they kind of, if you dig down, if you did a little pie slice, think of a cake. Better idea. Think of a cake with 26 layers, and each layer is some civilization layer that they can go back further and further and further and further and further. So you have 26 layers of ruins, and it goes from pre-Israel Canaanite. You've got Egyptians at one point, before the time of Israel proper. Egyptians controlled this area. They had it as a stronghold for everything going by. You have Solomon area. There's some stables that were part of this complex. King Ahab, the guy with Jezebel, we'll come to that in a minute. This was part of one of his complexes and one of his palace areas. There's a neat water tunnel, but there's 26 layers. And one of the things is, with layers, they just keep building up. For example, in that bottom image, part of this image, I don't know if you can see it well, there is a circle. See that circle of stones? So this is the remains of a temple, a Canaanite temple. So this is before the time of what we would think of as Israel and the people like Abraham and stuff like that before that. So it is a Canaanite temple from 3,500 BC. The sanctuary of this temple, 48 meters by 22 meters. That is about twice as long as our sanctuary over there. This thing was huge. In the middle of that is that circle down there. That was the altar mound. But what you can start to see when we say it being in layers, if you can look how that at one time was ground level, everything has built up on top of it. When you'd have new construction, you'd have some battle, everything would get crumbled down, they'd build and they just kept building up. So this is an excavation that showed this ancient temple. King Ahab's Asherah stone. King Ahab was that guy with Jezebel. Asherah was a Canaanite goddess. So King Ahab, who got in trouble, created an Asherah stone, a recognition of the goddess Asherah. Not supposed to do that. But one of the other things that King Ahab did is he created a tunnel. One of the things you had on here, even in his time, it had risen up because it was a long period of time. One of the things that you had is you didn't have a good source of water. So if you're going to have an area which had walls and all these other things, because it was a fortified town, but if you don't have a good source of water, anybody can come and create a siege, and you don't have a good way to get out of it. So that is walking down and down and down, and what you have is 40 meters underground. 40 meters underground is a tunnel. Ahab had his people build. They had to dig it out of the ground. They had to cut through the rock. This is walking through the tunnel. So this was all done in about 850 BC, hand-cutting a tunnel through the rock. At the end of it, when you get to the end of it, there's sort of a pool which a spring kind of comes in, and they had access to this pool. And there's a whole thing about how they could try to protect that, and it wasn't very visible. But this is how they managed to make sure they would have water if there was ever a siege. Are you slightly claustrophobic? Can you imagine doing that without electric lights? The last real quick comment about Megiddo, as old as it is, it's also mentioned in Revelation, but in a way that you might not have noticed. So if you ever had those classes in Revelation, kind of studied it or read some of those things like the Left Behind series, it talks about Armageddon. Here's your little answer, Revelation 16. And they assembled them at the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon, Greek Armageddon, just kind of slurs the A a little bit. Hebrew comes from the Hebrew. The Greek Armageddon comes from Har Megiddo. Translate that into English, you get Tel Megiddo. It's the Mound of Megiddo. So that's all that we have on, or all that I have on Megiddo. And now we have some other things from some other folks to share with you tonight. As they're coming up, any quick questions about Megiddo? Yeah, wherever you like.
So it was kind of amazing to stand there and look out across the Jezreel Valley and really be able to put the Bible in perspective, because you could really see how important this area was at that time, because everyone moving north to south had to go through that area. And to continue on some of the stuff that we're talking about tonight, we're talking about some of the oldest areas that we visited, and one is Tel Dan. So Tel Dan is an encampment or an area that was ascribed to the tribe of Dan. And it's in the northernmost kingdom of Israel, and it's near the mouth of the Dan River, which sits at the base of Mount Hermon. And Mount Hermon is the tallest mountain in Israel. It's actually the only mountain where they ski. And yes, during that time of year, they do ski on Mount Hermon. It's about 9,800 feet tall. We even visited a different area that we probably will talk about later on called the Druze community, which is part of the Golan Heights, which is right there at Mount Hermon. This area around the mouth of the Dan River is absolutely beautiful and breathtaking because there is so much green. Think of just going down by one of our rivers here, walking along the Yadkin, and how much vegetation there is. And that's what you get with the Dan River. Now, the Dan is one of 4 tributaries that feed into the Jordan River. And this was an area that there is still some little bit of controversy as to whether the tribe of Dan was ascribed to this area or moved to this area. after Israel, basically, or Jacob, gave the lands to the 12 tribes. In this area, it's one of the oldest Canaanite areas, second only, I think, to Megiddo that we visited while we were there. And what you have there is you have examples of things from both the Bronze Age and from the Iron Age. And we'll talk about that. We'll see a couple of examples of that. This is actually one of the only areas where something has been discovered with King David that was outside of biblical record. There was a tablet that mentioned King David that was found during an archaeological dig near the city entrance to Tel Dan. And it's one of the only other records we have for King David, which is amazing. I know it's kind of hard to tell from the pictures that you see here how tall things are or how big of a structure this actually is. This stands approximately, I would say, about 10 feet tall. And there would have been parapets on top, so it would have still been another 2 to 4 feet above that where the fortifications would have been. But this is the wall that you would walk by as you were going to enter the city on one of its edges. And you would come down this long walkway and you come to an area which is the entrance. And here on the right-hand side, where the blue tarp is, this is the area where they found the tablet with the information on King David. And they're still doing live digs today. There were people there working while we were there, and it was rainy and cold, and they've got the tarps out there to keep themselves covered up and keep themselves dry while they were there working. But this is the entrance into the city of Dan. This is just another picture that kind of gives you an idea of the wall down here to the left on the picture. And then the gate sits up in the corner here. So as you can imagine, anybody coming into a fortified city, they're walking past all of this fortification, and to get entrance into the city, they are all funneled into one area that's almost a little hidden when you look at the city from this perspective. Now, right inside the gate, you go between these two large, and they're called pillars, and right inside the gate, you see this structure right here. And this structure actually is called the king's seat. The king's seat is about the size of this table, and it would have housed a chair where the king would sit, and there would be columns on each corner and a cover over top, and he would be flanked by 2 guards, one on either side. And as you entered into the city, you would have to pass by the king. Now, why would you want to pass by the king? Or why would the king want you to pass by him? Well, the king at that time then controlled the money and the taxation. So there would be a tax to enter the city. And if you didn't pay your tax, you didn't get to enter. Or if you had outstanding debts, the guards took a hold of you. Or if you were trying to enter the city to cause harm, you could not get in, because this was one of 3 gates that you had to pass through to get in most of these cities. Not just one, but 3 consecutive gates to get into the city proper. And at each gate, there would be guards. The stones that you see down here on the ground, when you walk through there, they are actually carved to some degree, so they're grooved. And that was a way that they would help the chariots come into the cities. Because if they were smooth, the horses couldn't pull the chariots. They would just slip, as you can imagine. As you can see here, it's awful wet on the day that we were there. And these rocks are slick, as Angie can attest to. And she might even talk about that later on. Not there. Like we saw at Megiddo, there was also a pagan altar that was at Tel Dan, and actually this is one of the most well excavated areas in Israel. It's been extensively studied for a long time from an archaeological standpoint, And this is a very large altar area that was from about the time of King Jeroboam. And you had this area up to the right where people would sit, and then you had down here in the middle where this open area would be the altar. And this was an altar to the god of Baal. So this was truly one of the pagan sites. This was one of the most interesting things, though. As they were digging here, what they found is they found another gate on the other side of the city. It was a Bronze Age gate that was ascribed to about the time of Abram. And so therefore they called it the Abram Gate. And what you still see the superstructure today. And they kept it covered and trying to preserve it. In the middle would have been the entrance to the city. And then on either side you had two very tall pillars, which would have been the guard gates, and then the guards would have been on the outside as well.
So Jason, where is this in relationship to the map? Right?
So as you're looking at your maps, if you look up near Safed and the Golan Heights, we're up in that area of Israel.
Okay.
Not quite to the area of the Golan Heights, but somewhere up near in between Safed and Tiberias on the map that you have here. And so those rivers then would feed into the Jordan River, which then feeds into the Sea of Galilee. And then on the other side, the Jordan comes out and goes down to the Dead Sea. Any other questions about Tel Dan? It's hard to see in pictures, and it's even hard to describe just what things look like because you can't get all the full depth and breadth of everything that you see there. And I'm going to ask Kim to come up here and help me with this one. She and I were both kind of interested in our next topic, and it's really, we're moving up in time. We've moved from about 1500 BC when Tel Dan was a thriving community, and now we're moving right to near the time of Christ from about the time of the 1st century BC. And we're going to talk about Caesarea Maritima, which to me was one of the most interesting places, and there were a couple of others that kind of fed into that. Caesarea Philippi, and we also went to Masada, which we'll see here in a minute. And these were all areas where King Herod the Great, not King Herod of when Jesus was crucified, but King Herod the Great, who was had to be one of the greatest architecture builders and engineers that had ever been in this area, just because of what they were able to accomplish in the short amount of time that they accomplished this. To put it into perspective, how long do you think the Great Pyramid took to be built?
Long time.
It was almost 50 years for the Great Pyramid to be built. What we're going to look at now, and in the next slides, when we switch over decks, you will see areas that were built over about a 10 to 20 year span. And some of the structure that you see here had to be along some of the same scale, if not larger, than the Great Pyramid. So Caesarea Maritima is just north of Joppa or Jaffa, which is in the Tel Aviv area. So if you're looking near Tel Aviv, so just north of there is where Caesarea Maritima would have been. You're only about 20 minutes north of Tel Aviv on the Mediterranean for where this large port was located. And at the time, it was one of the most important ports for Israel and Jerusalem because all of their goods would have come through this area just because of what it was and how it was created. There were smaller ports in other areas that are now larger areas in modern day time, like in Tel Aviv, but this would have been the center of trade for this area from the Mediterranean. So it's one of the best examples of what construction and architecture would have looked like at that time and what they could accomplish. It was also very important from the standpoint of biblical terms, and there have been some important finds there that are just reassuring that yes, the Bible is telling the truth. And so we'll talk about the Pilate stone, and I'll let Kim talk about that a little bit. So to give you an idea of what this complex actually looks like, here's an aerial view that we were able to grab off of the internet. And it's quite an extensive complex where number one is down here at the bottom in the little round structure. That's the Roman theater. Right next to the Roman theater was the palace complex, which is where number 2 is. And you kind of see that kind of rectangular area, and it extends right up to the edge of the Mediterranean. And you're going to see probably one of the best summer homes you could ever have here in just a minute, as far as being on the locale of the Mediterranean. The Hippodrome, which is the large ovoid structure in the middle, is where the chariot races would have been. And then on the other end was where the harbor was located. And then next to the harbor, which is kind of difficult, but there is a straight line right there next to number 5. That's actually the remnants of the Roman aqueduct that fed water into the city. This would have been a city that had fully functioning running water and sewage all the time at the time of Christ. So just a couple of little tidbits. It probably was the site where Herod was living at the time of Christ, just because of the palace structure and how important this area was. We don't have complete knowledge that that's exactly where he was because he built all these other things. And then his son Herod would likely have been living there at the time that Christ was crucified. This would have been the port where Paul was sent to Rome once he was arrested. And they actually did show us the stairs that would have gone down to where the boats would have docked, that quite possibly Paul had walked those stairs in shackles to be moved to Rome at the time. It was introduced to Christianity by Philip, and later on Paul and Peter went to Caesarea Maritima to spread Christianity. And then Peter baptized a centurion, Cornelius, in this area as well. It was built in the 1st century over about a 10-year period, and the stone where it's a stone that is ascribed to Pontius Pilate, who dedicated it to the Emperor Tiberius at the time. And Kim has a picture of that here in just a moment. But then Josephus Flavius was a Christian writer who was a big historian at the time, and he went to all these different areas and has some of the most extensive recordings of what life would have been like in a lot of these areas that we went to that were Roman cities at the time. It's also been a very important center for Christianity and religion since that time. It was taken over by the Arabs, and then there was a Byzantine church that was put onto the property. The Crusaders came in the 1200s and rebuilt some of the church and areas there, and we'll see some of the construction that they brought to the area that is still in existence today and kind of discuss why that is there. And I'm going to turn it over to Kim just for a moment on the Colosseum, or for the theater.
Flip your microphone.
This is the large amphitheater that was there, and this actual structure is one of the places that they said did not have anything built on top of it, kind of like where Scott was talking, the other one had like 26 different levels. This theater did not. Those stadium seats are all original. And just amphitheaters in general have got these amazing acoustics that you can take, like, go up at the very top and just have the small group that was with us, and they could sing and you could hear it without any sort of microphone whatsoever. Looking into why that is, it's not necessarily the structure itself, it's really the secret of the limestone. Those are all limestone seats, and I guess the limestone will absorb the lower frequency of the sound coming in, but yet reflect back the higher frequency noises. So that way it kind of like filters out the background noise, but projects the higher frequency noises. And this is just a larger view of the theater. And we did have a group that went up there and sang, but actually don't have a recording of that particular singing session, but we do have recordings from some of the other churches where we sang, or Jason sang. I always opted to be in the back taking pictures.
That's still in use today, too.
That is still in use today, and actually, you can see right here how it is close to the sea. They can actually like run water in and flood it if they want to do some sort of like activities that are like water-based. And I didn't have any notes as to what those activities were, just the little scribble as to the fact that they can flood it if they want to and choose to.
So if you look where we're standing in the front of the structure here, in behind would have been the staging area, so there would have been archways back there with large curtains. So all of the performers would have been in behind that area and then would have come forward. But like Kim was saying, even the areas down below where the steps are, they could flood that for any type of skiing, whatever they wanted to do.
Pretend naval battles.
Exactly. They could do anything that they wanted to for any performance. And if we go back one little step, even though there are no bad seats in this house, there certainly are really good seats, like any theater. And you can pick that out right in the middle of the picture. There is a square box, the first box seats, and that's where the king and his family would have sat during any performance.
This is the real pilot stone that was found at Caesarea Maritima in 1961. Today it lives in the Israel Museum, and it's the only known evidence outside the Bible where we actually have Pontius Pilate described. And the inscription actually was like a part of a larger inscription to Tiberius Caesar from Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. And you can kind of see part of the Tiberius and the Pontius Pilate, and then Judea. And
So this is overlooking that rectangular area that we were talking about, which is where the royal palace would have been. And yes, these are the true columns from that time that are still in existence today, sitting there where the royal palace would have sat on that site. You can get a little bit of a picture of the scale if you look at the people standing on the other side of the columns there as to the size of what the palace would have been over that area.
That is a person. Between my fingers, standing up.
So this was a very spatial home. Inside the palace, on the far end, right at the Mediterranean, there was the royal bath. And if you know anything about Roman culture, they were all about their baths and staying clean, especially with the royalty. And so in the royal bath here, what you see in the background on the left and on the right, you see that large rectangular area? That's the actual bath itself. In the foreground, what they have uncovered is mosaic tile that was from Herod's time. So this was the tile where he would have, had chairs or whatever, and then would have entered the bath from there. But you can see it's just an absolutely amazing summer home with an amazing natural pool that he could have enjoyed. This is a little more of a close-up of the mosaic here on the left. And you can see some of the artwork and the detail that went into these mosaic tiles. And to some degree, you don't understand completely until you get right up on this. And I have some pictures from a different area that uses this exact same style of mosaic tile. And you can see the intricacy and the smallness of the tiles that they use to create the images that you see there. So here's the hippodrome. The hippodrome is where chariot races would have occurred. And the hippodrome extends all the way from here where we took the picture down to the other end where those other structures are. And that's about the length of 3 football fields. And so you can imagine if you had a chariot pulled by 4 horses, how much speed they could pick up coming down the straightaways. Now, in the movies, when you see chariot races, you see chariots going in the same direction, right? They all start at one point and they go in the same direction. Our guide was telling us that that's just Hollywood. Chariot races actually went in opposite directions. And they had these very tight turns here on the end so that they would have maximum damage, which was the whole point. It was a spectacle. It was a show. And so the people were much like what we would find a very boring football game, as if everybody stood on the field and just stood there and played two-hand tag. They wanted to see destruction. That's what they wanted to see. This is just an aerial view of the end of the hippodrome where we were standing. And this is one of those amazing engineering and architectural feats. So they had toilets. And they had toilets more like anything that you would expect them to have toilets. The hippodrome could have sat approximately 15,000 people. So on a chariot race day, you could imagine you got 15,000 people drinking wine and eating food. They need toilets, right? The toilets are actually located in this area down at the bottom where you see the cut through the little semicircle. And all along that wall, there were seats of stones that were, the stones were about 6 inches wide and about 1.5 feet long. And they had space between the stones. Well, under the stones was an aqueduct system where the water would come in from the Mediterranean, it would go through that system, and it would carry the waste away. Then there was a second aqueduct system at their feet where they would have sat that had fresh, clean water running through it, and for, a coin, you could purchase a sponge on a stick. So when you went to the bathroom, you had some way to clean yourself. And they would dip that sponge on a stick in the clean water. And that's how they used their toilet system. And as you can see, it's all open to the air. But you're wearing long robes, so there's no modesty anyway. This is an area where the stables would have been, where they would have kept the horses for the chariot race. And so these were just some of the stall walls that are still in existence today. And then the Nymphaeum, or Nymphaeum, however you say that. You know more about this one. This was your picture.
This is my picture. I don't know a whole lot about this, other than it's just one of the ones that was there during Herod's time in this whole complex.
And I believe
A piece on that, it's a pool, and all those little arches had statuary, and they weren't just white. One of the things that you don't have anymore is the sense of color. All of these things would have been painted and enameled and all sorts of things like that. They love the sense of color. But over 1,000 years, it gets worn off, and the paint's gone, and things like that, too.
one of the most amazing things about this site was the way Herod created this harbor. And the walls, we're going to talk about in a minute, those are from the Crusades. But the top picture on the right is from the outer harbor, and then the bottom picture is the inner harbor. And the stones that you see in the top picture actually is the division between the outer and inner harbors. So what they did is they created these large jetties that went out into the Mediterranean. And these jetties weren't just rock jetties like what we see today. They were mounds that were created, and then there was structure built on top of it. These just ornate towers were extending right out into the Mediterranean and would have been built out onto the jetty that you see over there on the right-hand side. And then as the ships came in, they created the inner harbor so that there was that water break, and so you didn't have any damage to the goods and the ships and the people as they were unloading their cargo on the inner harbor. The walls on the left-hand side are actually from the time of the Crusaders. And this is an example of what's called a dry moat. And a dry moat, as it says, there's no water in it, but the walls are created at such an angle that you can imagine it would be very difficult to try and scale those walls and attack a city. Another area that we visited was another...
Jason?
Sure.
It is 10 till 8. Do you think to keep close to the time that we were planning, could we keep this one for next week?
We can. Yeah.
Since I know choir still needs to try to get together, and I can imagine another 15 minutes in the sauna would be wonderful, but
Yeah.
that, I think, starts to chew into the commitment that you made to folks. But now you have the teaser. So Masada is Herod's fortress. And if we can do that for next week, we'll start there. That'll work.